Let me welcome you all to the spring 2022 edition of the O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, soon to be Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia starting July. This semester's Jindal lectures are on a topic of huge political and contemporary relevance, not only for South Asia, but perhaps worldwide. The topic is the media and democracy in India today. And these lectures will be delivered in 2 rounds. The first lecture being given today is by Siddharth Varadarajan. The second lecture will be on May 11th, and it will be delivered by Shekhar Gupta. It may be that the 2 perspectives are different. It may be that they're the same. We don't know. We'll see. Siddharth Varadarajan is not only a trailblazing journalist, a founding co-editor of The Wire, one of the most important news portals to emerge in recent years, but in my view, also one of the sturdiest pillars of intellectual freedom in India. It is an India that is increasingly hostile to the idea of intellectual freedom, and indeed to the idea of freedom of expression in general. It takes a lot of courage and conviction to fight the emerging trends in an India that I have described for you just now. He is, as I said, the founding co-editor of The Wire, but also a senior fellow at the Center for Public Affairs and Critical Theory in New Delhi. And until October 2013, he was the editor of The Hindu. He was an economist by training before he joined journalism. He's trained at London School of Economics and at Columbia, and also taught briefly at NYU. And in his incarnation, post-economics incarnation, as a journalist, he has been a lecturer at the journalism school at Berkeley, a Poynter Fellow at Yale, recipient of the Elizabeth Newford Memorial Prize for Print Journalism, the Bernardo O'Higgins Order Award by the President of Chile, which is the highest civilian honor for a foreign citizen in that South American country, and the well-known Ramnath Goenka Award for the Journalist of the Year some years ago. Siddharth will speak to us for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we have 3 commentators, 2 in person and 1 joining us from Washington. We will start, I'll introduce them when their turn comes, but let's first welcome Siddharth Varadarajan to the Center, to Watson Institute, and to Brown. Welcome, Siddharth.
Thank you very much, Professor Varshney, and the entire staff of the South Asia Center and the Watson Institute for all the arrangements and the invitation. It's very nice to be back at Brown. I think I last spoke here maybe a decade ago on a different topic, Afghanistan. And I'm here under very different circumstances in a world and in India that has changed considerably since then. And I'm glad that the question of the media and democracy in India has been chosen as the broad theme for my remarks today, because I think there is arguably no subject more important than this today. As a reporter, one is generally used to writing and giving the odd soundbite rather than giving a lengthy lecture. And I took the help of Google to convert the allotted time of 50 minutes into a rough word count. Google assures me that 6,000 words is what will fill 50 minutes, and that's what I have pretty much written. So I hope that I don't overextend the time allotted and, of course, your patience. India's democracy has always been less than perfect, and its media has tended to mirror those imperfections. But the reason I have chosen to speak on this subject today is because we are at a particularly dangerous moment in the life of both. Of course, when we look at the decidedly shaky state of all our pillars of democracy in India, it is worth remembering the long arc of neglect, indifference, and vandalism that has brought us here. The situation the Indian Republic finds itself in has not been the product of a day, nor is it the handiwork of a single person or party. This much is very clear. Future historians will no doubt be accurate when they say New Delhi was not destroyed in a day. But we must also have the honesty to recognize that the fabric of Indian democracy has been so badly and deliberately damaged by Narendra Modi, his party, and his government that we are today at an inflection point from which there will be no easy deliverance of the kind India experienced in 1977 when Indira Gandhi was voted out of power after she had imposed a 2-year state of emergency. Why do I say this? Consider just this one piece of evidence. By 1977, most media houses were chafing at the restrictions imposed on them by Mrs. Gandhi, even those who infamously had chosen to crawl when asked to bend. But today, a large section of the media has fused itself with the ruling power vertical and is doing all it can to enable and accelerate the democratic backslide. Another large section is unwilling to use the freedom it has to report on what's going on. This unwillingness of the media has contributed in no small measure to the crisis of democracy in India. Since we are talking about the fate of hundreds of millions of people, there is every reason for us to be gloomy and despondent about what lies ahead. And yet, as we face the very real danger of losing our democracy, it is important for us to believe that we can and will pull ourselves back from calamity. In my lecture, I will therefore try to transcend, at the very end, the gloom and doom by pointing to the small rays of sunshine that I believe still exist. Democracy is not something you put on display in a museum, but a way of life which you must fight to conserve and strengthen and extend. Of course, it is not without irony that Narendra Modi is planning a reliquary for democracy in the very building which currently houses India's parliament. Having just bought the first ticket to the ugly new Museum of Prime Ministers in Delhi, built to overshadow the Nehru Memorial in defiance of India's heritage conservation laws, Mr. Modi hopes to inaugurate his Museum of Indian Democracy in 2025. That year will also mark the birth centenary of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Hindu supremacist organization to which the Prime Minister and most of his top leaders belong. These men would dearly like to celebrate their centenary with other milestones, and the work to get there has begun in earnest already. When he visited Delhi in July 2021, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked at a joint press conference with his Indian counterpart how he would address the Indian government's backslide on issues such as human rights? That was the question put to him. This was an obvious reference to the mass arrests and repression that had accompanied the scrapping of Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy and statehood, the repression of those who had opposed the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act and the new farm laws, the targeting of Muslims and Christians by Hindutva organizations, and the persecution of journalists, with more than 50 journalists or reporters across the country facing criminal prosecution for stories that they had done. Mr. Blinken was cautious and even guarded in his response, tempering his assessment of what was happening in India by presenting what he calls the democratic recession as a problem the United States is also confronting. And I quote from what Blinken said, "Every democracy, starting with our own, is a work in progress. We've seen the challenges that our own democracy has faced in the past and faces today. But this is, in a sense, common to all democracies. We talk about, in our founding document, the search for a more perfect union. That, by definition, means that we're not perfect and that our entire quest is to get closer and closer to the ideals that we set for ourselves. And ultimately, I think we have in our democracies self-righting mechanisms that are made up of free citizens of different backgrounds, different faiths, a free media, independent courts powered by a system of free and fair elections," unquote. Mr. Blinken's rather anodyne answer to that question drew a response from India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. And I will quote it in full because it represents the clearest statement yet, in the idiom of modern politics, of the attitude of the Modi government towards democracy. Dr. Jaishankar said he told Blinken three things on the question. And I quote, "One, that the quest for a more perfect union applies as much to the Indian democracy as it does to the American one. Indeed, to all democracies. Number two, that it is the moral obligation of all polities to right wrongs when they have been done, including historically. And many of the decisions and policies you've seen in the last few years fall in that category. And third, that freedoms are important, we value them, but never equate freedom with non-governance or lack of governance or poor governance. They are two completely different things," unquote. Before I subject Dr. Jaishankar's 3 points to closer scrutiny, let me share with you what emerged in the latest meeting he had with Mr. Blinken on April 12th, which is just a few days back. This time, the US Secretary of State did not wait for a question to be asked about his views on the state of Indian democracy. Instead, as part of his opening statement at the 2+2 meeting with the Indian foreign and defense ministers in Washington, he made the following observation. Quote, "We also share a commitment to our democratic values, such as protecting human rights. We regularly engage with our Indian partners on these shared values, and to that end, we are monitoring some recent concerning developments in India, including a rise in human rights abuses by some government, police, and prison officials," unquote. This was a direct rebuke, made sharper by the fact that Mr. Blinken not only referred to a rise in human rights abuses in India, but was open about pointing the finger at the Indian state itself. Dr. Jaishankar's response came a day or two later. He suggested, in response to a question put to him, I think, by PTI, the Press Trust of India, that views of the sort that his American counterpart had offered on India were driven by what he called, quote, interests, lobbies, and vote banks. And that India, too, had views on the human rights situation elsewhere, including the United States. Now, while there is no doubt that the Biden administration, like its predecessors, takes an instrumental view of human rights around the world, Mr. Blinken's assertion linking a rise in abuses to the actions of Indian officials rests on the State Department's own documentation. Mr. Modi's tenure as Prime Minister has overlapped with the Obama and Trump administrations. And the State Department's reports then, too, were hardly flattering. So if Presidents Obama and Trump chose silence in the face of India's deteriorating human rights record, was it because they were driven by a different set of interests, lobbies, and vote banks than President Biden? Or could it be that the scale of violations in India, coupled with New Delhi's refusal to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has tilted the scales in Washington's mind? My lecture is not about foreign policy and geopolitics, so I will set aside this line of thought and return to the state of India's democracy and media, and also to the 3 points Mr. Jaishankar made in his meeting with Blinken last year. Don't talk to us about human rights and democracy, he had said as his first point, because, as Mr. Blinken had himself conceded, the quest for a perfect union is common to both India and the US. The second point Jaishankar made was that the Modi government has a moral obligation to right historical wrongs, and was doing so through many of its decisions and policies. Now, Dr. Jaishankar did not identify any specific decisions, but clearly the scrapping of Kashmir's autonomy, the passage of the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, and his government's push for a Ram temple at Ayodhya, which the minister had elsewhere described as, quote, a pledge redeemed, a heritage reaffirmed, unquote, would seem to fall in this category of reversing what the BJP would consider historical wrongs. It is a different matter that these decisions and policies have contributed to the violation of people's rights on an unprecedented scale, and to the growing sense of insecurity and vulnerability felt by Indian Muslims. We also know that the rhetoric that exhorts the righting of historical wrongs is part of the armory of Hindutva, which believes India's quest for freedom began not with the advent of British colonialism, but of what they call Muslim rule some 800 years ago. Mr. Modi himself speaks of 1,200 years of slave mentality, quote unquote, which takes us back to the 9th century, some 100 years after the Arab conquest of Sindh. Third, and somewhat cryptically in his comments with Blinken last year, Dr. Jaishankar said that while the Modi government values freedoms, in other words, democracy and human rights, these should not be equated with a lack of governance. The Indian External Affairs Minister was no doubt referring to the laments Mr. Blinken had heard from the civil society activists he had met in Delhi at a well-publicized interaction the same day. The Indian government had already scoffed at the various global freedom and governance indices on which India's ranking has fallen sharply in recent years. By saying freedom should not be equated with poor governance, Dr. Jaishankar was recycling the old authoritarian cliché about trains running on time. The message was that good governance is what the Modi government is providing, even if this encroaches on freedoms. Last November, the intelligence czar in the Modi government, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, expanded on this third point when he warned trainee police officers, quote, the new frontier of war, what we call fourth generation warfare, is civil society, unquote. It is civil society, he said, that can be subverted, that can be suborned, that can be a divided idea, that can be manipulated to hurt the interest of a nation. Taken together, what Messrs. Doval and Jaishankar are saying is that the work of civil society activists, human rights defenders, environmentalists, farmers' unions, Dalit and Adivasi activists, women's rights activists, students, and independent media can all be manipulated to hurt the interests of the nation. And that standing up to this subversion, this abuse of freedom, is what good governance and the rule of law are all about. In a nutshell, civil society is dangerously and inherently uncivil. Of course, the official narrative concedes that problems of abuse can still arise. Democracy is, after all, as Jaishankar and Blinken said, a work in progress, a common quest across all democracies. But that India's constitutional institutions are up to the task of resolving these glitches. It is to this claim, so central to our audit of Indian democracy, that we must now turn. Mr. Blinken was being polite and diplomatically impeccable when he spoke of a common quest for a more perfect union in every democracy. So it is hardly surprising that Dr. Jaishankar would latch on to that. To the non-diplomats among us, however, it should be clear that any talk of a common quest is to compare chalk and cheese or steak and dhokla. Like India, the US is sharply polarized politically. And it is true that America underwent unprecedented upheavals in the last weeks of the Trump administration, driven by lawlessness from the very top. In the same way, many of the actions which undermine the basic rights of Indians have also emanated from the political pinnacle. But this is where the comparison wears thin. I'm not qualified to speak authoritatively about the role played by the courts, the Justice Department, the FBI, election officials across India, and the US media. But I can say with full confidence that in India, the role played by countervailing institutions, including the media, in the face of ongoing threats to democracy, has been one of abdication and complicity. And that is what makes all the difference. Each of the self-righting mechanisms that Mr. Blinken had identified as essential ingredients of a democracy, the equality of citizens regardless of faith, a free media, an independent judiciary, and a fair electoral process, are quite visibly broken in India, as I shall explain. I will deal with the equality of citizens in the next section, but let me focus here on the judiciary, on the media, and on elections to highlight where exactly the problem lies. The Indian Constitution envisages the judiciary in India as an independent pillar of democracy, distinct from the executive and legislature. In reality, it is rare for the lower judiciary, which is where most legal processes begin, to confront the government when issues of fundamental rights are at stake. And when it does, its decisions can be easily reversed. Akar Patel is a former head of Amnesty International India and the author of a recent book on Modi's India. Last week, he was prevented from leaving the country to deliver a lecture at the University of Wisconsin. A lower court, in this case a special court that is tasked with looking at the cases filed by the Central Bureau of Investigation, pulled up the government for the arbitrary manner in which it had stopped Mr. Patel and ordered it to allow him to fly out. Yet the CBI ignored the order, so Mr. Patel found himself stopped a second time at the airport when he tried to leave. I don't want to burden you with detail, but one aspect of this case is worth highlighting to give you a sense of the official arbitrariness that is today undermining the fundamental rights of Indians. The CBI told the immigration authorities to stop Mr. Patel at the airport, asserting that he was wanted for questioning in a criminal case. But Mr. Patel himself was not told that the CBI wanted to question him. Joseph K. would find Mr. Patel's predicament familiar. The problem, sadly, is not confined to the lower judiciary. The Supreme Court of India, to cite one example, has yet to find the time to deal with the various petitions challenging the constitutionality of key decisions taken by the Modi government. Chief among these is the manner in which Article 370 of the Constitution was read down in August 2019 to strip the people of Jammu and Kashmir of the autonomy they were guaranteed and of their statehood. This decision was accompanied by one of the harshest and longest crackdowns on the civilian population that the Kashmir Valley has ever seen. Dozens of mainstream political leaders, including 3 former chief ministers, were arrested and detained. The internet was shut down for months on end, and the functioning of the media made virtually impossible. The people of J&K have been deprived of their right to elected representatives for nearly 5 years now. Through all this, the Supreme Court has kept its intervention to the barest minimum. Since the sleight of hand used to render Article 370 a dead letter is unlikely to withstand judicial scrutiny, essentially the required consent of elected representatives was substituted by the consent of the governor, who was appointed by the federal government. The BJP is quite happy with the delay in the matter coming up and being argued before the court. if and when the matter is eventually adjudicated, the court could easily be prevailed upon to conclude that the sheer passage of time has rendered the challenge infructuous, to use the sort of word beloved of Indian judges. I should note in passing that what Mr. Modi perpetrated was not just an assault on the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir, but on the basic structure of Indian federalism. India is actually the Union of India. And if the Union government, on the basis of its strength in the national parliament, can so easily do away with the very statehood of any state that it makes a mockery of the federal principle. Can it do to Tamil Nadu tomorrow what it did to Jammu Kashmir yesterday? Certainly, this must have been a question at the top of the mind of the DMK, which was one of the few regional parties to speak out in defense of the Kashmiris on this question. Another case that the Supreme Court has steadfastly refused to hear, and which goes to the heart of our discussion today on democracy, concerns the constitutionality of anonymous electoral bonds. Introduced in 2017-18 by the Modi government, the BJP has consistently pocketed 3/4 of all money raised through this device. In 2019-2020, this amounted to 2,555 crore rupees, approximately 320 million US dollars. The bonds comprise money donated to political parties by corporations whose identity is kept hidden from the public and from the Election Commission of India, but obviously a company which donates anonymously for the Election Commission and the public's point of view is quite happy to share that information with the recipient of the money. So there's no secret as far as the recipient is concerned. The BJP knows who's giving the money. And this method of political financing, election financing, has been presented by the Modi government as a step towards greater transparency. A petition challenging the anonymous bonds was filed by the Association for Democratic Reforms in September 2017. That's nearly 5 years ago. The Election Commission also submitted an affidavit opposing the scheme, saying that anonymous electoral bonds ran contrary to the goal of transparency in political finance, not rocket science. The last time the matter was heard was in March 2021, when the ADR, which had filed the original case, sought an interim stay on the sale of these bonds because there were assembly elections coming and the ADR did not want anonymity to drive the elections in terms of financing. Sadly, the court refused to grant a stay. By then, however, the Election Commission appeared to have had a change of heart. It now opposed the call for a stay and also declared that it supported electoral bonds, but only wanted them to be more transparent. Even though the threat that anonymous electoral bonds the threat that these bonds pose to free and fair elections is obvious. A ruling party can strike deals with corporates for generous donations in exchange for favorable policy decisions without the public having any idea of where its money is coming from. Yet the Supreme Court has refused to expedite hearings on this crucial matter. Just last week, however, Chief Justice of India Ramanna, who was, I think, 2 months away from retirement, gave an assurance that the court would soon take up the matter of electoral bonds. But you wonder why this has been kept pending for nearly 5 years. The Election Commission's apparent U-turn on electoral bonds is also of a piece with its blatantly partisan monitoring of compliance with election law when it comes to violations by prominent members of the Modi government and, of course, by Mr. Modi himself. During the 2019 general election, the Election Commission sat on complaints that had been made against Mr. Modi for his use of anti-Muslim messaging during the campaign. For example, he had mocked Congress leader Rahul Gandhi for standing from Wayanad in Kerala, a constituency, Modi said, quote, where the minority is the majority. It was only after petitioners asked the Supreme Court to direct the Election Commission to adjudicate the complaint that the 3-member body moved swiftly in a 2:1 decision to find the charges against Mr. Modi invalid. And even then, the Election Commission refused to pass a written order. It was simply a one-line statement dismissing the complaint. The dissenting election commissioner, Ashok Lavasa, who was slated to become the next chief election commissioner, soon found himself battling corruption charges, which mysteriously melted away when he quit the commission to take up a job at the Asian Development Bank. I should add that when The Wire investigated the use of Pegasus spyware in India, we found Mr. Lavasa's number in the leaked database of probable targets. As if the Supreme Court's indifference and the Election Commission's complicity towards the subversion of democratic norms by the government were not bad enough, the use of Pegasus against leaders of the opposition in the midst of crucial election campaigns tells us how unlevel the electoral playing field has become. This is, in some ways, even worse than the Watergate scandal, because unlike Watergate, the surveillance and spying on the opposition was conducted using public funds and using government officials. Which brings us to the media and the government's treatment of political freedom as a source of subversion, because Pegasus, as we shall see, was majorly also used against the media. Last year, The Wire helped break a major story about the use of military-grade spyware by an unidentified government client of the Israeli company NSO Group against a range of targets in India. Of the 300-odd telephone numbers that we were able to verify, around 40 belonged to journalists. 5 of those belonged to journalists who work for The Wire or write primarily for it. In my case, and the case of my co-founding editor, M.K. Venu, forensic tests established the presence of Pegasus on our smartphones. Other targets included human rights defenders, lawyers, the opposition political strategist Prashant Kishore, Congress leader Rahul Gandhi, and even the young woman who had raised sexual harassment allegations against Ranjan Gogoi when he was the sitting Chief Justice of India. The Modi government has refused to confirm or deny its use of Pegasus, but the Supreme Court rejected the government's claim or attempt to duck an investigation on the grounds of national security. The establishment of a technical committee under the stewardship of a former judge to probe the extent to which Pegasus was used and to identify who deployed the spyware and on whose authorization is one of those glimmers of light I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. The government will no doubt stonewall the committee, and then the ball will be back in the court of the Chief Justice of India. He can then either take action, as the Constitution empowers him to do, or he can throw up his hands in frustration. The stakes are high for the government, for the integrity of elections, for the right to privacy of citizens, and of course, for the freedom of the press. The Pegasus revelations came on top of 6 years of unremitting government hostility towards the media. The period has seen a refusal by the Prime Minister and his office to respond to questions from the press in a structured and transparent manner, a marked departure from the practice followed by his predecessors. Mr. Modi famously has not held a single press conference in the 8 years that he's been Prime Minister. Manmohan Singh, I think, held 3 or 4 large press conferences in Delhi, but he frequently interacted with journalists on his various tours abroad. Mr. Modi provides no opportunity for journalists to be able to ask him unscripted questions. Mr. Modi and other government ministers also do not consent to be interviewed by any journalist or platform that is likely to be independent and want to ask follow-up questions. Ministers routinely use invective against journalists, like the word prostitute coined by General V.K. Singh, who was a minister in the Modi government. BJP supporters, driven in most cases by the party's IT cell, troll journalists, especially women, and subject them to vile abuse. Earlier this year, The Wire reported on the BJP's use of a hidden app called Tech Fog, which is capable of gaming social media trends, hacking inactive WhatsApp accounts, and trolling opponents of the government on an industrial scale, complete with a drop-down menu for paid operatives to select, if they so wish, body parts of women reporters they wish to highlight in order to be especially abusive. Now, the media in India might have been able to live with all this, as we have done with frivolous defamation cases for years, except that the BJP and its governments have, of late, upped their offensive. It is becoming routine in states like Uttar Pradesh and the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir for the police to file serious criminal charges against journalists for the stories they have done or have attempted to do. Siddique Kappan has spent more than a year in an Uttar Pradesh jail, charged as a terrorist for attempting to report on the rape and murder of a Dalit woman in the town of Hathras. In Kashmir, Fahad Shah and Sajjad Gul have been booked under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the Public Safety Act. Asif Sultan, who has spent more than 4 years in jail on UAPA charges that the state knows it can never substantiate were a trial to actually take place, was rearrested this week under the Public Safety Act when a court finally gave him bail on the terror charge. In Manipur, the TV journalist Kishore Chandra Wangkhem spent 2 lengthy bouts in jail for Facebook posts, including one where he questioned how cow urine and cow dung could protect anybody from COVID-19. He was arrested under the National Security Act, which is one of those detention laws, one of those laws which empowers a state government to detain people without charge, without formal charge. And it took him several weeks of fighting it out in the courts before his release was ordered. It took the Andamans and Nicobar Islands-based journalist Zubair Ahmed 17 months to get the Calcutta High Court to quash the serious offenses he was charged with for a tweet in which he had asked the police, the Port Blair police, why they had quarantined a family simply because they had spoken to a coronavirus patient on the telephone. I can go on and on at sickening length, giving you examples. Unless you think this is a problem of the boondocks, remember that it was the police in New Delhi, the capital, which filed a case of sedition, no less, against senior editors Mrinal Pandey and Rajdeep Sardesai and others, simply for reporting that a farmer who had died during a protest in January 2021 had been shot. I should add that The Wire itself and me personally, we face something like 5 criminal cases filed by the Uttar Pradesh police, all of them linked to stories that we have done which the police or the state government disapproves of. Though the burden of this criminalization of journalism is largely falling on freelance reporters or journalists working for smaller outlets, the big media has trimmed its sails. Proprietors are either risk-averse or subsist on business models which depend on government goodwill. Some, like the owners of Republic TV, Zee News, India TV, and Sudarshan TV, are ideologically committed to the BJP's cause and derive considerable advertising support from the establishment. English newspapers tend to guard their own freedom, but government views in the form of puff pieces and op-ed columns are much more common today than they have ever been in the past. The Modi government has been least successful in managing the digital news media, a lament made openly in a group of ministers' report on the government's communication policies. And this report was leaked about a year and a half ago. In response to its inability to subjugate the digital media, the government has taken two measures. First, it introduced a cap of 26% on foreign investment in digital news. Earlier, there was no cap. And it also made approval of this FDI subject to government permission. In other words, any project involving proposed FDI, even up to the limit of 26% in digital news media, is subject to approval on a case-by-case basis. So totally ad hoc and depending on whom the government wants to favor. Secondly, the government has introduced a new set of guidelines known as the Information Technology Rules 2021, which give the government the right to order the taking down of content if an interministerial committee of bureaucrats finds inappropriate. The Wire and other news platforms have challenged these IT rules, and there is now a stay on the operation of its most obnoxious sections. But the ball remains in play, and the peril continues. As a journalist, I am naturally worried about the future of media freedom, given the current trends. Our hope is that the judiciary, which has battled for a free press in the past, will continue to be an ally in freedom. What I am less sanguine about is the growing coarseness and communalization of public discourse in India, and the failure of the courts to act in a way that sends a clear and unambiguous message towards those actively promoting religious bigotry, especially against Muslims. And that's what I want to turn to next. Shortly after a visit to Germany in 1936, the great American public intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois made a telling observation about the persecution of Jews by the Nazi regime. As someone who had seen and written about the racism to which African Americans in his own country were subjected, Du Bois zeroed in on what he believed was a key difference. It was impossible, Julia Boyd quotes him saying in her book Travelers in the Third Reich, to compare the plight of the blacks in the US with that of the Jews in Nazi Germany because, quote, what is happening in Germany is happening in a lawful way and openly, even if it is cruel and unjust. But in the US, the Negro, he said, is persecuted and repressed secretly in flagrant violation of the laws. Du Bois was not making light of one method of oppression, but rather noting, presciently as it happens, that persecution elevated to the level of law marks an inflection point that should not be ignored. I was struck by Du Bois's comment because in my own assessment of the plight of religious minorities, especially Muslims in India today, this shift from being, quote, repressed secretly in flagrant violation of the laws to a cruel and unjust targeting and persecution that is, quote, happening in a lawful way and openly is occurring before our very eyes. I have edited a book, Gujarat, The Making of a Tragedy, about the anti-Muslim violence in Gujarat that Narendra Modi presided over in 2002 as Chief Minister of the state. The book was conceived as a permanent public archive of a crime that had unfolded with great intensity over a wide area and lasted a few days. The 1984 massacre of Sikhs, presided over by the Congress party when it was in power, has also been documented, though not with the same degree of detail. Both of these incidents represent the high water mark of what Paul Brass has called the institutionalized riot system. The killings happened because the party in power willed them. The aim was to polarize society, mobilize Hindus, and strike permanent fear in the hearts of the targeted minority. The police served as ready accomplices through various acts of omission and commission. It is true that the main culprits all escaped punishment. Yet, the violence unleashed against the Muslims of Gujarat and the Sikhs of Delhi was flagrantly illegal, and key instigators, especially top leaders, were careful to remain in the shadows. Today, the primary impulse behind the riot remains, but the system has undergone a change of technology. Instead of a short, intense bout of large-scale violence in a geographically confined area, the preferred method is to terrorize with 1,000 cuts. The field is cast wider, much wider, and the operation is conducted on a more or less continuous basis. Most importantly, the BJP's strategy now is to persecute the Muslims in a lawful and open way. In some cases, this means the use of new statutes or the retrofitting of existing laws. It also means weaponizing the law through so-called private complaints against Muslims that the police are quick to pursue. The arrested individuals then have to struggle to find lawyers who will take up their case and get them bail. Consider a recent example. Kuthma Sheikh was arrested in Bagalkot, Karnataka last month for a private WhatsApp status message on Pakistan's Republic Day, which simply said, "May God bless every nation with peace, unity, and harmony." She was arrested on the basis of a private complaint by a man who is believed to be linked to a local Hindutva organization. The charges invoked were two sections of the Indian Penal Code, which deal with creating enmity between groups on the basis of religion, race, etc. When asked why they had arrested the woman for such an innocuous message, the police said, quote, "We received a complaint that the post was provocative and aimed to cause friction in society. Since the uploader's intent is not determined, we are still investigating the matter," unquote. Hindutva activists pressured the local Lawyers Association to refuse her representation, claiming that she was anti-national. Kuthma Sheikh eventually made bail, but not before spending 2 nights in jail. This is one Muslim woman's story, but there are dozens of such cases in India, mostly in BJP-ruled states. Instead of investigating Kuthma Sheikh's intent behind such an innocuous post that he could clearly see was harmless and not likely to cause any kind of violence, the inspector never paused to wonder whether it was the intention of the complainant which warranted probing. This is because he understands the new system. In the old riot system, he knew he had to look the other way when pro-government activists attacked someone. He didn't need to be instructed to do this. His inaction was instinctive. In the new system, the inspector knows that his role is to throw the law book at any quote-unquote anti-national element whom the Hindutva activists point their finger at. Sometimes when the activists go too far and kill or seriously injure someone, the police will file countercharges against the victim, as happened in the case of Akhlaq, perhaps the first victim of cow vigilantes in North India a few years ago. The new system works well because it enlists and empowers vigilantism by Hindutva foot soldiers and introduces a permanent element of uncertainty into the lives of Muslims who must now carefully consider whether their well-being could be jeopardized by what they eat or wear, read or post, say or do. The goal is the erasure of the Muslim as visible individuals, as a collective, as a cultural or geographical marker. The erasure of place names in Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh. The ludicrous assaults on Urdu. The attempt to ban the hijab from schools. The calls for the social and economic boycott of Muslims that have gathered steam in the aftermath of the communal propaganda launched during the pandemic. The targeting of halal certification on meat and other products. The constant attempts to reclaim Muslim and Islamicate monuments as Hindu. The aggressive politics of taking Hindu religious processions through Muslim neighborhoods as a means of supposedly reintegrating them with India. And the summary demolition of Muslim property seen recently in Khargone in Madhya Pradesh are all part of this process of erasure. The Sangh Parivar sees these moves as the righting of historical wrongs, to use Dr. Jayashankar's phrase. Some Hindutva leaders, notably Yati Narsinghanand, routinely call for the mass killing of Muslims and the eradication of Islam. All of these provocations, and I want to underline this, lest you think that this is some fringe, all of these provocations have received explicit or implicit support from elected officials and leaders of the BJP. More significantly, they have never been condemned by a Prime Minister who claims he stands with all Indians. The process of erasure represents only one aspect of the open and lawful persecution of Muslims in India today. But there are laws which have explicitly marked out Muslims as subjects for punitive action. And this represents a dangerous new turn in Indian politics. I wonder how many people in our audience today know that when a Muslim man abandons his wife, in other words, fails to divorce her properly as per law, he can actually be imprisoned. Whereas a Hindu man or a Sikh or a Christian man, for that matter, who does the same, faces no criminal sanction. I'm referring to the 2019 law which added the layer of criminality to a process of divorce, the instant triple talaq, that the Supreme Court had already struck down as invalid. In 2019, the Modi government again singled out Muslims as a category in law via the Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. This time to exclude them from the benefit of citizenship being given to all other undocumented migrants from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. If the goal was to provide benefits to bona fide victims of religious persecution in these countries who had fled to India, a laudable goal, no doubt, this could have been accomplished by passing a law to grant refugee status to victims of persecution and creating a transparent administrative and judicial process to have the claims of applicants processed speedily. Individuals with refugee status could then have been made eligible for citizenship, as is the norm in democratic countries with laws in conformity with the 1951 Refugee Convention. But the goal, I suspect, was something else. To use Dr. Jayashankar's words again, it was the righting of a historical wrong. India, for the BJP, is the natural home of Hindus, or of people following the so-called Indic religions, many of whom were left stranded by partition. So, for the Modi government, the CAA was a logical step, with, of course, Christians added to the mix because they are an obviously persecuted minority in Pakistan, and their exclusion would have made very little sense. I wish to make one further point on the CAA. BJP ministers like to argue that the CAA deals with non-Indians only, and that the law does not discriminate against Indian Muslims in any way. This defense is morally spurious, but it is also factually inaccurate. Consider the example of two Indian women, one Hindu and one Muslim, who have been married to two undocumented Bangladeshi men, one Hindu and one Muslim. Under the unamended Citizenship Act, the children of both women are considered illegal migrants and are liable to be deported along with their respective fathers. The CAA, however, offers a clear path for the Hindu Indian woman to live a normal family life free of the risk of disruption due to deportation. But the Muslim Indian woman must continue to live with the risk of expulsion of her family from India. Surely, no democratic country can countenance such blatant discrimination as part of statute. But 3 years on, the Supreme Court has yet to find the time to properly hear the challenge to the constitutionality of the CAA. In similar vein, a number of BJP-ruled states have introduced or sought to introduce stricter laws against religious conversion. And the carve-out given to those who convert people back to their quote-unquote original religion means that ghar wapsi, or homecoming, activities of the RSS can continue even as conversions to Islam or Christianity are criminalized at the first instance, especially when there is an interfaith marriage. Where does this grim tour that I've taken you on leave us? I had promised some rays of sunshine, so let me try my hand at some optimism of the will. To begin with, my own case. The Wire is not going anywhere, nor are we alone. There are dozens of media platforms, especially websites, and some newspapers and TV channels, which doggedly pursue the path of independent journalism. There are thousands of gutsy freelance reporters, and I want to especially salute all those who are working in Jammu and Kashmir, who refuse to be intimidated, even though they are in many ways the most vulnerable. Video content on YouTube has created a whole new audience and market for news, especially when some of these videos get circulated through instant messaging apps like WhatsApp. This has challenged the monopoly and the bias of big media. Digital news viewing gives audiences the freedom to customize their preferences, and we find that there is a growing demand for professionally reported output from independent media channels. The rays of light are not just in the media. Despite the near total control of big television and big newspapers by the government, the fact that there were two mass movements in the space of a year, one against the CAA in 2019-2020, and the other against the farm laws in 21-22, shows the willingness of ordinary citizens to challenge the government and fight for principles and issues they believe in. Helped by alternative media, these protest movements have effectively challenged the relentless democratic backsliding that India has witnessed. Elsewhere in India too, whether in Silgher, Chhattisgarh, or Odisha, or Assam, or elsewhere, ordinary people have not given up their faith in their own power. It is these ordinary people who cherish democracy the most. They will be India's salvation. Thank you. Ashu, you want me to be here?
Thank you, Siddharth. I'm sure the discussion will be thought-provoking after this stellar lecture. Our first commentator is Edward Luce, who is reaching this audience and the online audience from Washington. Ed?
Hello, I can see you. Can you see me?
I can see
Oh, you can now.
Hi. Ed Luce is the US national editor and columnist at the Financial Times. I've known him since his days in Delhi, but I chose him for the commentary for the reason that he has reported from several democratic polities, including Delhi for several years, including the Philippines when democracy looked shaky, including, of course, the United States during Trump years, but he came here much before that. In his pre-FT life, pre-Financial Times life, he was also the speechwriter for Treasury Secretary Larry Summers during the Clinton administration. And he's authored 3 books: The Retreat of Western Liberalism, 2017, Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent, 2012, and a book whose genesis I saw myself in Delhi, In Spite of the Gods, The Strange Rise of Modern India, 2007. So Ed, you have 10 minutes for the commentary. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ashu. It's a real honor to be responding to Siddharth's brilliant lecture. Very sobering, but analytically very clear lecture. Not just because of the quality of what you've just said, but because I think if there is to be some signs of hope for the future of an independent and robust Indian media as a support to hopefully a non-backsliding Indian democracy, then it comes from figures such as you and organizations such as The Wire. I've watched from afar some of the intimidation to which you and your colleagues have been subjected, and the fortitude and tenacity with which you've stood up for your stories and your journalism, and I think those are the ingredients of hope for the future of India. I should start there with an apology for not being there. I really did want to come and plan to come, but My wife earlier this week had a rather freakish accident where she was reaching for a cupboard, slipped, fell backwards, and broke both her wrists instantaneously trying to cushion the impact. And she had surgery a couple of days ago. So I'm literally spoon feeding her. And much though I love catching up with my Indian friends in person, I love my wife even more, and I think I, probably made the right decision to stay here. The second sort of health warning is that Ashu, who, as he just pointed out, I've known for a long time, and who was a really wonderful person to talk to, as he still is, but in particular when I was based in Delhi, and very much helped shape a lot of my thoughts about the bigger sociological trends going on in India then and since then. I did warn him that, it's been a while since I was based in India, and I feel, a little bit, not fraudulent, but it's a little bit tenuous to have me responding to Siddharth's lecture, but he brushed my objections aside and waved them away. And I'm glad he did, because it gave me a very good reason to get up to speed on the condition of India's media in the context of the future of Indian democracy. So I was based for the Financial Times in New Delhi for 6 years at the beginning of this century. And it really feels like an epoch ago, not because it's that long. It isn't that long a period of time, but because of the scale of the changes that have happened and the speed of the changes that have happened in the short time since the early years of this century. When I was based there, Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Prime Minister, then Manmohan Singh. And although the Gujarat riots did happen when I was there, and I covered them, and I did interview Narendra Modi as Chief Minister of Gujarat several times, a fairly discomforting experience. And although I had some foreboding about the future of the Hindutva project, I wouldn't have begun to have grasped just how massive the underlying sociological as well as more surface political changes that India has undergone, mostly for the negative, in the last few years. And nowhere is that better expressed or captured, really, than in the changes we've seen in the main organs of Indian media. When I was in Delhi, I used to quite frequently appear on NDTV, or I'd go on various channels, but my favorite one was always Pranoy Roy's NDTV. And it was my favorite because the anchors were very professional, I think objective. I think they had a public interest motive in their journalism. And I therefore found it a very productive channel to appear on. The main anchors I dealt with were Rajdeep Sardesai, who Siddharth mentioned, Barkha Dutt, and one Arnab Goswami, who was actually one of the quietest and most professional and most polite of the anchors on NDTV in those days. He shouted less than Rajdeep. Now, of course, Rajdeep is known for his shouting, never abusive or angry, but Arnab was a quietly spoken anchor. And now when I watch this demagogue, and I hope you'll forgive me for using sort of plain language, impugning his interviewees, assassinating characters, spewing diatribe, and basically being a propagandist, an organ of propaganda for Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism. I have to pinch myself to remind me that this is the same Arnab Goswami that I used to deal with. His snarl, which I think is really his motif with interviewees, turns into a bended knee only when he is interviewing people in power. And there's one particular interview he did with Narendra Modi a couple of years ago, where the camera caught the fact that Modi had all the questions Goswami was going to ask. So I see Arnab Goswami really as a personification of the change that has taken place, at least in a lot of the main English language and indeed Hindi language broadcast media. Now, people talk about Goswami as being the Tucker Carlson of Indian broadcast media, or the Sean Hannity or the Bill O'Reilly. And I think there's certainly something to that, but I think that understates his significance as a media figure. He, in the United States, Fox, of course, has all these, I think, very baleful influential anchors whose effect on American democracy is not good. But there are other channels. There are plenty of other networks and cable TV stations with very different points of view. In India, that's becoming less the case over time. The Arnabification, if you like, of Indian media is a very disturbing side, and it's not just confined to English language broadcasting, which of course only reaches a minority of Indians. It's there in the Hindi channels. It's there. This style is there in the print media in all languages, and of course in social media, really in a big way, where BJP bots, I guess, sort of give us a real-time demonstration of Gresham's law, the bad driving out the good, with extraordinary ferocity and efficiency. So Siddharth has done a fantastic job, I think, of summarizing what's happening in the Indian media and the impact that's having on Indian democracy. So I don't want merely to repeat what he's just said or put them in my own much less informed words. What I think I might add a little bit of value is by talking about the connection between a free media and the health of a democracy. And then I'll conclude by pointing to one or two areas of hope, which speak to India's core strengths as an inherently and stubbornly pluralistic society that even in the face of the homogenizing project of the Sangh Parivar is going to be quite difficult to steamroller. And I should stress that, if we're looking for natural barriers to the growth of illiberal democracy in India or electoral autocracy, then language, I think, is an obvious one. The Indian Home Minister recently talked about making Hindi an official link language between the states. And I think this is just the kind of example of Indian overreach, of BJP overreach rather, that could boomerang on the party and on Modi. The 2011 census showed that a majority of Indians, a bare majority, speak Hindi, but only 26%, I repeat, just 26% speak it as a first language. So the tradition of linguistic identity is, I think, a natural bulwark, particularly in the South, against the larger Hindutva project. But let me talk a little bit about media and democracy. So in recent years, I've been watching, along with many of my colleagues, and I'm sure many of you, the fate of Viktor Orban's Hungary. Viktor Orban, of course, is the man who coined the term a liberal democracy and is the resident strongman, a Putinista in the European Union. And he's really perfected the model of a liberal democracy. And the first steps that he took are ones that people are now becoming very familiar with in India, which is to demolish really any serious independent media. And the methods that Orban used and has essentially completed this project are, again, very familiar to people in India. The government withdrawing advertising from critical media outlets, tax raids and audits on the companies of proprietors who also own critical newspapers, harassment, detention of independent critical voices in the media, and the pressure on the private sector and on businesses to withdraw advertising from them. This is all mostly fairly peaceful. You're not seeing gulags, you're not seeing mass detention, you're not seeing the direct closure of newspapers. You do sometimes see spurious removal of broadcasting licenses, but generally it's done in a very 21st century way through pressure, consistent pressure. And it's, as I say, mostly been successful. I think India is about 2/3 of the way to what Orban has achieved in Hungary. And of course, once you've got rid of that natural bulwark against the accretion of power and of electoral autocracy, then the government can do all kinds of things much more easily than it would otherwise have been able to do. So if you think about the closure of foreign NGOs in India, if you think about the far more important, I think, intimidation of the higher courts and the Supreme Court, if you think from my perspective, watching India from a distance, of the role that high commissions and embassies, Indian embassies, are performing in terms of subtle intimidation of Indian students and academics in countries like Australia, the UK, and Canada. This is the kind of thing that having a tame media makes much, much more easy to do. So the link, I think, just on that very simple level is very, very plain. Now, if we go by the Hungarian model, the Indira Gandhi-style emergencies are just not necessary. I noticed Siddharth mentioned that actually what happened during the 1977 emergency in those 20 months was nothing compared to this. This is more subtle. The Washington Post has a motto, democracy dies in darkness. I think nowadays it dies actually mostly in daylight and sometimes in broad daylight, but by 1,000 cuts, again to quote Siddharth. And, you have at the same time a very difficult task of persuading Indians that this is an existential threat to Indian democracy and freedom. It's an elite concern more than a mass concern. And Modi has been very skillful at providing material security and goods to India's poor, but a welfarist dimension to the Hindutva project, a lot of it borrowed from Congress, health insurance, a minimum sort of basic health insurance for the very poor, secure toilets, security for women, various cash handouts, administered far more efficiently than Congress ever did. So the chances, of really panicking the Indian people amidst this sort of incremental squeezing of the Indian media is, I think, pretty slim. Now, I try and keep up with what's happening in India by talking to my many Indian friends. Some of them travel through here. Occasionally, I go there, although not since the pandemic. And by reading a lot of the still existing very high quality journalism on the internet, mostly on the internet, like The Wire, because it's easier to exist in that fashion. And occasionally I'm unwise enough to tweet a critical opinion of something or other the Modi government has done, the CAA, being a very good example. Or tweet a link to a piece by an Indian author, somebody like Pratap Banu Mehta or something from The Wire, that's also critical. And the avalanche of response from the BJP bots is quite something. I mean, I deal with Trumpian bots on the internet and in our comments on the Financial Times. It's nothing compared to the Sanghi army on the internet. It is an extraordinary, organized, efficient, and effective intimidating tool. It doesn't affect me. I don't mind being called an India hater. I'm not. I actually love India. Or a Hindu phobe, again, wrong. Or, more unmentionable words in Hindi beginning with the CH sound, which I won't spell out. I don't mind that because I'm based here. There's no threat to me. But you look at somebody like Rana Ayub, the kind of threats, the visceral, nasty, and very plausible, credible threats that she gets, it's no surprise that she's a rare figure. Most people, quite understandably, would rather have a quiet life, would rather let discretion be the better part of valor. It's not a question of good men doing nothing, as Benjamin Franklin said. It's a question of keeping your peace of mind, of preserving your job. And so I understand how these forms of intimidation are so effective. Now, let me conclude, because I know it was only 10 minutes and I've probably gone over, by quoting something that Siddharth said at the beginning, which I wrote down. The fabric of Indian democracy has been so badly and deliberately damaged by Narendra Modi, his party, and his government that we are today at an inflection point from which there will be no easy deliverance of the kind India experienced in 1977. I picked up on that point earlier, but I think it's really worth emphasizing that, broadly speaking, Indira Gandhi was about perpetuating her own power. There wasn't really a coherent, larger ideological project, which of course is in marked contrast to the Sangh Parivar project. She did far worse things in those 20 months. Mass detention of opposition figures, closing of newspapers, of course, the forced sterilization campaigns, the slum clearance, etc. She did far worse or more egregious things in those 20 months than Modi's done since 2014. But that's what worries me the most. The Hindutva project is a profoundly illiberal and ultimately undemocratic long-term project. My friend, with whom you'll all be familiar, Ram Guha, I think with deliberate mischief, described it as the goal of creating a Hindu Pakistan, guaranteed to stir up the BJP bots. But it's as sophisticated as Indira Gandhi was crude. Modi doesn't need to suspend the constitution to achieve his aims. He doesn't need to directly close publications or broadcast channels for the most part. He can do this, if not in broad daylight, then with a subtle tap on the shoulder behind the scenes, and gradually, incrementally, what we saw as inherent to India's vibrant pluralistic tradition suddenly becomes something rather rare and precious and increasingly difficult to see. So I'm going to end by saying I'm really, honored that you'd asked me to join this discussion, and particularly to follow Siddharth, who's the personification of what we need to be seeing in India more of. And so thank you for having me. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there or cheer you up with the words that I've just given you.
Yes, and for your remarks, very careful remarks. Our next speaker is Paula Chakravartty, Associate Professor at the Carleton School and the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. She has, in her career, worked a lot on media. And the books I want to mention are Media Policy in Globalization, 2006, Global Communications, 2008, Mediatized Populisms, 2017, Infrastructures of Empire Towards a Critical Geopolitics of Media and Information, 2016. She serves on the executive board of NYU Association of University Professors and is also affiliated faculty at the Asian Pacific American, all in slashes, Institute at NYU. Paula, the next 10 minutes are yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is my first human live event since the before times, so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to Professor Varshney for the invitation, and to Stephanie Abbott-Bundy for all the logistical work to make this happen. And thank you, of course, to Siddharth for his essay, but also his work on The Wire and his bravery and all of the work of all of the journalists and editors and folks involved in independent media in India. What I'm going to do, we were given the paper not too long ago, shall we say, and so my comments are a little bit scattershot. So I'm going to hopefully make 3 points that will, be in different levels of coherence. While the specifics of the dire situation with the attack on activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens that Siddharth has laid out in his essay speak to recent events in India, as Ed Luce's comments make us realize, we are reminded of parallels across many parts of the world, from Brazil, the Philippines, Turkey, to Egypt. And the kinds of parallels that the paper highlights are not contained only in the global south. The themes raised in this essay speak to the shifts in the media democracy landscape in the US, in Europe, and we really must think of these changes regardless of our post-Trump era here in the US. Across both legacy media and social media, we see the mobilizing of violence against racialized, minoritized subjects, whether internal enemies, illegal immigrants, or terrorists. So my comments and questions are both have to do with the specifics of what Anand Teltumde has called the subservient media in India that Siddharth so thoroughly outlines, and in a sense, the implications of what is happening beyond India. The central point made in the paper today is that under the Modi BJP government, the role played by countervailing institutions, including the judiciary and the media, in the face of ongoing threats of to democracy, has been one of abdication and also complicity. And it's a quote from the paper. Both institutions are failing in ways that they did not during the emergency era of 1977. And in a sense, there's an acceptance of the BJP equation of good governance with the necessary unfreedom for minorities and for dissent. So my question really, the first question has to do with how do we make sense of this changed media-state relationship? How do we explain it? How do we account for it? There's a lot of description in terms of what has happened to back up the fact that the media has been compliant and complicit, but the question is why, right? Why? So this change is characterized by what Siddharth says is 6 years of unremitting government hostility towards the media, and a feature where media autonomy and independence is under attack. He lays out in a terrifying detail the kind of criminalization of journalism that's largely falling on freelance reporters and journalists working in non-English language media outlets and smaller news outlets, and the ways in which big media has, as he says, trimmed its sails. So what accounts for failures of the media to hold the BJP government accountable? Now, across the world, and in India certainly, we live in a more mediatized society today, but one that is less accountable, right? So you have hyper-mediatization, but less accountability. What is the explanation in India from the perspective of journalists, editors, and owners of media organizations and platforms? Is one question, but what are the transnational and global factors at play? Because media and media technologies are global in nature. So in some sense, it would be helpful to have a clearer sense, Siddharth, of your thoughts on the kind of political economic architecture of media and information systems within which an organization like the Wire operates. Here I'm also thinking about, there's a lot of focus in your discussion, rightly so, on state control, on interference, on censorship, on criminalization. But I wondered also about the role of corporate actors and the restructuring of big tech I wondered also about the larger global phenomenon of the ethno-nationalist right and the ultra-right, the ways in which the Hindu right learns from and mimics and teaches similar types of modes of action vis-a-vis the media when it comes to the Israeli right, the American right, the kind of ethno-nationalist, transnational context is something I wondered about. A feature of shifts in global political economic transformation of media systems since the 1990s is that we've seen assertive commercial media institutions that have recast popular outrage against the violence of the state into a mandate for economic neoliberalism. Media actors since the 1990s, well predating this current government, have taken on the role of free market crusaders, prioritizing narrow definitions of economic freedom, mostly defined as entrepreneurial self-making over political freedom. One can posit that this has had perhaps pernicious long-term effects of devaluing principles of political freedom, especially for minoritized publics, including the right to dissent and to assemble, in media discourse and hence in public discourse. So when contemporary right-wing populist ethno-nationalists like Modi or Erdogan or Trump take this to a logical extreme, they are not operating in a total discursive vacuum. In short, the kind of good governance as unfreedom model of media and democracy that we see today can perhaps be traced to older media worlds of real news prior to 2010. The gradual but steady sidelining of political freedom and civil liberties such that today BJP's IT cells and its troll armies can so effectively erase, dismiss, ridicule, critique forms of dissent, especially minoritized dissent. So I guess I'm interested in thinking about the continuities a bit more as opposed to the rupture. I don't see the making of Arnab Goswami today as a kind of rupture, right? There's continuities that we need to kind of think about and maybe pay attention to. So related to the question of political economy of media and democracy, I would like to understand why. I also am one for hope and one for social movements, but why should we have hope in digital media platforms? You pointed out a little bit in your talk about the changes in the rules of governance of digital media, and you talk about digital media giving audiences the freedom to customize their preferences, and you talk about, you write about the growing demand for professionally reported output. But since 2014, when the Modi government first came to national power, the larger players, Facebook and Twitter, have been complicit in and indeed incentivized the spread of hostile, abusive, and violent content by the Hindu right, which is overwhelmingly and disproportionately aimed at religious and caste minorities and critics of the Modi government. Big tech has, for the most part, played a hypocritical game in India. It has inconsistently invoked principles of community standards and violations of human rights in shutting down critics of the Hindu right, including Dalit and Muslim voices, while claiming commitment to free speech in allowing abuse of Dalit and Muslim communities by the Hindu right to go unchecked. So I just wonder, how we think about a digital future that can be liberatory and emancipatory given the kind of constraints of big tech in India, but globally as well. My next set of questions have to do with the kind of argument that you're making about minoritization, Muslim minoritization in your essay, which I found very interesting. I was intrigued by the reference to W.E.B. Du Bois in the paper, and the argument that you're making here about how racism in the U.S. violates the law and in Nazi Germany abides by the law. That in India, the BJP strategy now is to persecute Muslims in a lawful and open way, and you were drawing from Du Bois's kind of prescience in seeing that distinction. I wonder about that reading a little bit, and but I do agree that Du Bois is very helpful in providing us with conceptual tools with which to make sense of the paradoxes of media and democracy today. One thing about debates in media and democracy is that while debates in media and democracy are very urgent, the theories which undergird our debates in media and democracy are very stale. They're very thin. They draw from theoretical frameworks that are that often have very little to help us navigate the world in which we live. And so in that sense, Du Bois, I think, is a very interesting figure to go back to. I'm not sure here about the reading of Du Bois because racism in post-Reconstruction Jim Crow U.S. legalized racial segregation. And it was, sorry?
I said that's right.
Sorry. And it was Du Bois's attention to the need for what he called militant journalism in the face of a global color line that I think we might revisit today. Du Bois was very critical of this notion of objective journalism. And so I think it might be helpful to think about that kind of differentiation and look at not just the kind of racialization of the minority, but one of the things that Du Bois, I think, is very helpful in helping us think through is the racialization and criminalization of the poor. And so there's a kind of class, race, minority class kind of thread that we might want to follow. Between 1910 and 1934, Du Bois, as the editor of the NAACP newspaper Crisis, forged what he saw as a necessary alternative to the limits of objective journalism. Du Bois advocated for a militant journalism that aimed to change public opinion by appealing to the conscience of a nation to address systematic injustices and group domination. For Du Bois, racial exclusion was central, constitutive to American democracy, structuring the commercial media infrastructures of news production and, in his day, cinema, which was designed to maintain the global color line. So for Du Bois and other African-American critics, the rise of the U.S. on the world stage during World War II as the new global arbiter of freedom, distinguishing itself from European imperial powers in its support for anti-racism and anti-colonialism, rang hollow, given that the racist project of American democracy was being redefined in more insidious and necessarily global form. In a prescient essay published in 1944 in the American Journal of Sociology, Prospects for a World Without Race Conflict, Du Bois writes, "Our attitude towards poverty represents the constant lesion of race thinking. The turn towards Keynesian economics and redistribution in the US and Western Europe meant that the abolition of poverty was now imaginable for whites but remained unthinkable for the majority of the world's racialized and disposable poor, despite their political freedom from direct colonial rule." And I think there's something here about racialization of poverty that might be helpful in thinking about the current moment in India. Finally, a last point that your paper made me think about has to do with how we're sort of thinking through, again, the theory of democracy that undergirds our discussions about media freedom and democracy. And here I come to your argument or your hope, and all of our hope in a sense, that the power of the Hindu nationalist grip over the state will be challenged by ordinary people, as we see in the movements of the anti-CAA protests. I was last in India, January 2020, in Kolkata, and went to some of those protests and was really moved not just by the protests but the form of the protests, and of course the farmers' protests. More recently. So in thinking about this, again, I wonder, just in the same way that Du Bois is helpful for us to kind of think about the media democracy equation as the U.S. as the normative model, your discussion here made me think about Ambedkar's critiques of Indian democracy. And here, I guess what I was thinking about is the way in which this clear separation of civil society and the media as part of civil society in relation to the state might be something that we want to trouble a little bit. Ambedkar, who we might think of as having a more radical theory of democracy, here I'm drawing on the work of a young scholar named Hari Ramesh, who makes the kind of argument, oh, am I out of town? I'm out of time. Who makes the kind of argument that there's a sort of pathological imbrication between caste society and representative institutions. So here, I'm sort of thinking about the ways in which media institutions, including digital media institutions, represent or subvert the kind of power imbalances around issues of caste, around ethnic minority representation, et cetera. Okay, I'm out of time. As usual, the academic takes too much time in her 10 minutes. Thank you.
May I ask John or Grace or Stephanie whether we can go beyond 4 o'clock? To draw this to a close at 4 will be intellectually hugely unjust. Can we, Finn, can you help me? Yeah. If we can technologically, John is there. If we can go, let's say, till 4:10, let's draw a line at 4:15. How about that?
Yeah, we have another stream at 4:30, so we can't go past 4:15.
We can go, so we can go till 4:15. Thank you, John. Yes, and that brings the notion of intellectual justice back. Okay. Our last commentator is Salil Tripathi, a writer and policy advisor. We first knew him as a reporter from India, working for India Today, I think, if I recall correctly, among other things. Then a reporter from Singapore, then a reporter from Hong Kong. So, and then for his long association with PEN International, and is chairing of the Writers in Prison Committee of PEN International for as many as 6 years, and now, which ended in 2021, and he's now a member of PEN International's board. So for most of his life, perhaps all of his life, he has been writing about, reporting on, working on human rights. So, Salil, your comments on Siddharth.
Thank you, Ashu. Thank you, Siddharth, for grim, sobering remarks. And thank you both, Paula and Ed, for seeing the different dimensions that we need to bear in mind. Few thoughts. We are in the age of ironies, right? So I want to talk about 3 ironies first before we go on. First is the irony that this speech will be taken as an example and cited as an example by the Indian government that India is a free country, because Siddharth can say what he wants wherever he is. So we should note that that is going to be one of the responses to what he says. The video will not be curtailed, it will be accessible, but he might get an enforcement directorate's inquiry for some financial transaction from 1929, maybe, something like that. And you'll have to produce paperwork to prove that. So I'm just letting you know that. And these ironies are important because India now considers P.G. Wodehouse to be dangerous. So that's also something worth bearing in mind. Gautam Navlakha, the writer and activist who is in jail for charges which have not yet been formally presented, if I understand correctly, to the courts. And he wants to read P.G. Wodehouse, and he's told that that's dangerous. So it's a country where Wodehouse is dangerous, which may be a veiled joke on Shashi Tharoor, but I'm not sure of that. And the third is that, the third irony is that we have to recognize that the Supreme Court does speak up for journalists in India. When Arnab Goswami was in jail, it dropped everything. And he was released so quickly. So what are you complaining about Siddiq Kapan and a few other people when, a distinguished anchor such as Mr. Goswami, his freedom was considered so vital and so important. But sadly, that's the only levity that I'm going to touch upon in what I'm going to say now in response to what Siddharth said. He started quite rightly with 1977 and the whole notion of the emergency and what it did, and the bend and the crawl, the famous quote of L.K. Advani that he mentioned. I remember soon after emergency, Edward Behr had come to India. He had actually been in the British Army during the pre-partition days, and then he was Newsweek's international editor. And he said something to the Sunday Observer back in the 1970s, late 70s, or early 80s. And he said that press freedom in India is a jewel. Hold it tight and don't destroy it. And very, very sadly, and I think one point that, Siddharth, you do make in one of your early statements, but maybe, I mean, if you're turning this into an academic paper, this is what you want to go into, is that how it is indeed a culmination of a series of laws that have come. Defamation law in Rajiv Gandhi's time, Indira Gandhi's attacks, and, you touched upon the attacks on civil society. Now, those things are happening because of laws that P. Chidambaram put in place. So it's what's happening is that the current government is using the laws extremely efficiently, which were put in place, not just by the previous governments, but dating back to the British Raj. So I think that's something we need to bear in mind. Listening to you, and I've written a paper for the roundtable, which is coming out on India at 75, on media at 75. And one of the things that occurs to me is that there is a need for the brass check, the Upton Sinclair book, which was an expose on US media in the 1920s and 30s. And there's something that needs to cast that harsh light, because we episodically, occasionally look at Indian media closely about what it's doing, but there's not been a systematic, thorough examination of it. And, many of us have written about it, but there is a certain coyness and shyness. I write a column for a newspaper called Mint in India, and very often they want to know that, do we really want to go after someone, not so much because of any sense of fear. I mean, I must insist on saying that, but also because, maybe, are we a pot calling the kettle black? There is that kind of a suspicion about it, that can we really go after someone when we also might have similar problems? And I think it's something worth bearing in mind.
Similar problems as journalists.
As journalists, yeah, absolutely. Both in terms of being victims of it and both in terms of acquiescing with the system, which is what I'm coming to now, which is the whole issue of appropriation and co-optation that you talked about, and the capitulation that we see in the media. Because when Advani talked about, we were asked to bend and you crawl, the question now is that now they're asked to jump and they ask how high. That's what the Indian media typically are. One of the most cringe-worthy photographs I saw was, I think, in Mr. Modi's second year, when he's surrounded by the media with hundreds of people desperate to take selfies with him. And this is, I don't know why anyone would want a selfie with any politician. Let me put it that way. So it's nothing to do with Mr. Modi here, but it's something worth bearing in mind. But that co-optation is interesting. I'm so glad you stayed with Jaishankar throughout in the early part of the speech, because Jaishankar is an interesting character. For those who do not know, he was a distinguished foreign service official. He has been India's ambassador, he's been India's foreign secretary to Beijing and to Washington. And in theory, he's well-groomed and well honed in what India's foreign policy is about and what the Indian ethos is. And yet, when the CAA agitation was going on, when there were international crises going on, his main priority was to fight a rock star called Rihanna. And, he was very keen to fight with her and call her all kinds of names and so on. And the acquiescence on one side and the appropriation of the judiciary. You're so right in pointing out, Siddharth, of all these vital cases which are not being heard at all, because they're just getting pushed back and so on. And for other matters, the court does find the time to look into it. But to that, I would also ask, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I live away. I've not lived in India since 1990. But one of the things worth bearing in mind is the Indian Armed Forces. The number of people in uniform or who have recently retired and the kind of remarks that they make on Twitter and social media is interesting, shall we say. There is this, I can't remember his name, but the man with the bushy mustache who's on TV all the time. Yeah? So there are people like that who speak all the time, which in a language which is unbecoming in any company. To see a former service person saying it, serving police officers, serving IAS officers, writing in a manner that shows a kind of co-optation which is scary and unnerving. If I were a Muslim or Dalit, I would be very worried in India. But even if I were a secular liberal person, I would be very, very concerned about what that might do to it. Because the journalists, either they don't get an interview with the Prime Minister at all. The famous Karan Thapar and Narendra Modi interview, some of you might remember, where as soon as Karan Thapar presses a point, Mr. Modi drinks a glass of water and leaves. This is when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. and he refuses to continue the interview. More recently, Smriti Irani, who was yesterday speaking at Berkeley, but invited by the students of Berkeley. I was told by Berkeley. It was not an invitation from the university itself. That's what I'm told. But be that as it may, it's a free speech campus. It's fine. I mean, but Smriti Irani spoke at Berkeley yesterday, and so when she was being pushed on the price of, I think, oil and gas and in an airplane, and this journalist was rather persistent with a camera, immediately the response from everybody was, oh, you can't treat a minister this way. So the whole question becomes no longer about the function, which is the role of a journalist to hold a mirror to the society, ask tough questions, to one of process. Are you being polite or not to somebody who has been elected? So that's something worth bearing in mind. So when they're asked to jump, people want to ask how high. And it's so sad because some of the examples of past brilliant investigative work of Indian media now seems almost like we are talking about another country, whether it is Saeed Abdi writing about Bhagalpur or Ashwini Sareen going and buying Kamala and, Arun Shourie and Indian Express exposing what was happening with the under trials, Nirja Chaudhary writing about child laborers. All these are great stories of Indian media, which was all the flowering that we saw after 1977 when the emergency was lifted. And today you see it in the kind of organizations which Siddharth runs, and you might find it in Article 14, you might find it in Scroll, you might find it in Khabar Lahariya, but it's the portals. The newspapers seem to have abandoned that, and I don't know why. I mean, there's very little of that kind of detailed reporting that you see that, and television is hardly there. I mean, the main story that one of the channels and networks you spoke about was, of course, the Chavan Ke Sudarshan TV, whose main story last week was, why is it that Haldiram, which is a snack company in India, which makes things like Frito-Lays, I mean, it makes Bombay mix, as we would call it in London. I don't know, Chivda, yeah. So those of you who Hindi would know that. But anyway, and it had, I think it was Urdu or Arabic, I'm not sure which script it was on it, and they were complaining about it, that why was it written also in that language. So we also need to bear in mind that this is what, and I'm really, really glad you focused on the erasure of Muslims in the piece, because I think that's such a vital story. I mean, we can all add examples. The campaign against Tanishq, the jewelry company, Jashn-e-Riwaz, when Fab India came out with this campaign about Diwali and called it Jashn-e-Riwaz, which is, of course, an Urdu term, it was considered badly. The current Navratri, which is a North Indian Navratri. I'm a Gujarati, and in Western India, we have a different Navratri. Diversities, beautiful. But it's called the New Year period. And in that kind of a context, the ban on meat that has been going on. And it's just the acquiescence of everybody, the administrators, the courts, and everybody says, fine, let's leave it, let's not wake up and make it harder from this. And this, I don't know whether this was Yati, one of the people who gave an extremely fiery and crude speech against Muslims, calling almost for a crusade against Muslims in Varanasi, I believe, not long ago, when he was released from jail. I mean, because they get their bail when they want to. I mean, that's not a problem. He was welcomed as a hero. And I think that's the kind of question we have to ask. And a lot of the provocative questions which media has been asking, and has been asking very well, tend to get brushed aside. I mean, Mr. Jaishankar told Mr. Blinken that, we are for good governance. But if you dig deeper into try to find out what the good governance is, this is a country that removed 86% of the currency without anybody's by way of leave. And it led to an economic slide that persisted for 3 or 4 quarters. This is a country whose management of the second wave of COVID was utterly disastrous. But somehow none of that seems to matter. They say that that's fine, but when you mention it to on internet and Twitter, you're told, "Aayega to Modi hi." Whatever it is, the one who will return will be Modi. So there is something to it which we need to know, and I would love to know more about these glimmers of hope that you have. And maybe we need to honor them more. Maybe we need to name them more. Maybe we need to make those websites more public, more visible, more accessible. That becomes important. I can go on and on about the appropriation of heroes who are not Nehru or Gandhi, whether it is Bhagat Singh or Subhash Bose. That's something worth bearing in mind. So let me end with 2 or 3 final thoughts, because I am running out of time. One is, India may be the world's largest democracy. I always call it the populous democracy. Large is a weird term. And there's a huge divide now between the function and the structure. India does hold elections, but whether it's a democracy, we don't know. It has newspapers, but to what extent the media is free, we don't know. It has courts and rule by law, but is it the rule of law? We don't know. I think these are the things worth bearing in mind. Another thing that I think we need to mind, and I'm glad Ed talked about Rana Ayub, but Neha Dikshit, Barkha Dutt, if you're a female journalist, the kind of hatred you get is completely unacceptable. And I think it just keeps going on. And I think something needs to be done. And I don't know whether that means giving more power to the states or letting Twitter and Facebook to form better rules. I don't know. It's become harder for people to support civil society. It's impossible now to donate to Amnesty. I'm sure it's very hard to donate to Wire, because if you do donate to Wire, somebody is going to look at your tax file at some point. So people are hesitant about even subscribing to it. So that's the problem. But I do want to end with hope, but not with hope as in concrete terms, but with 2 statements, 2 quotes from 2 people I admire. One you will immediately recognize because it's Gandhi and it was in the film. When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. And what gives me the hope to say this is what Václav Havel said. And this is what he said. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. And that's the kind of journalism you do. Thank you.
Let me propose the following. We have 20 minutes left. There are 2 ways to organize our time. 20 minutes left. Ed, are you still on? No. There are 2 ways to organize our time. We could ask Siddharth to respond to some of the comments, or we could take your questions. I think I would prefer the latter. Let's take audience questions now and see how much of our 20 minutes can be used that way. And we can discuss, we'll see whether we have time to take up some of the comments that were made. So what are the audience questions? I can't check on, I can see Ed.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can see it. Questions for Siddharth, especially, but feel free to ask other panelists as well. Yes, Kalai. And in the interest of time, brevity will be the soul of intelligence.
It's not, in fact, my question is a question from a friend of mine. I just happened to meet a Kashmiri friend in Chennai before, leaving to India. He was very particular that I should meet him this time. He instead spoke less about politics, more about life, because he doesn't want to talk about politics. He has this question, particularly to he believes that Wire and the sunshine intellectual somehow, actually, that's a force that's somehow opposing BJP. Now we all hopeful in that sense, being party to that. So his question is, the vision of India, who opposes the BJP now, the Indian intellectual, he sees some sort of poverty of imagination in that. Is that, can India be imagined as a negotiated contract as a civil, social, legal, instead of ever believing Indian nationalism? Can someone be Indian, either Kashmiri or Tamil or Assami or anyone, without necessarily believing in Indian nationalism, ever possible to imagine? Because the opposition also seems to be giving that scope for him. So that I was wondering why he's asking, but I thought I'd worth asking this question here.
Siddharth, will you answer?
Yeah, sure.
I think in the interest of, I'm not sure, because he didn't have the microphone with him.
Yeah.
If you can repeat what you think is
Yeah, no, I think the question that Kalai posed on behalf of a Kashmiri friend is it possible for us to reimagine India?
Without left-right nationalism.
Yeah, and without the kind of conventional nationalism which is, which is there in front of us. And I think that this is a very good question. And the answer should be very obvious, which is that in a country like India, which has people of different backgrounds, diversities, cultural experiences, historical experiences, the basis for staying together in one country as a union is that the basic minimum is that this has to be with the willingness of everybody, right? And how this willingness is measured and codified is something that people have to work out. I think the Constitution of India had a certain approach. The phrase Union of India is the formal title of the country. And, this is something which governments at the center, in fact, we shouldn't even be using the term center, because center implies that the union government is somehow on a pedestal compared to the states, which is not the case. So I think your friend's question is right. I mean, it takes us slightly away from the subject of this seminar. But I think that whether it's Kashmir or any other part of India, it is futile to think that India can be a strong, united country if it does not carry all the people who are part of this, who are within its borders, in terms that are agreeable to all, right? So I think the phrase you use, in negotiated contract, social contract, I mean, these are definitely things that any liberated, liberal, forward-looking democracy of the kind India should aspire to be would want to look at very seriously.
Are there other questions? Rajiv, a former dean, professor of economics.
I was wondering to what extent the regional language media is subject to the same sort of problems that the English language media is. In some sense, does that pose a bigger threat to the government? Are they facing more, repression? Are things different? Yeah.
Because we're being recorded and he did have the microphone, so once again, the question, it was also on my mind. What is Siddharth's assessment of regional media, or what is sometimes called vernacular media, as opposed to English media? How would he analyze that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the state of health of regional media closely mirrors the political conditions in that particular state. So in a state, in most of the Hindi region, I would say that the dominant media is very much towing the central government's line, the union government's line, BJP's line. And you have a lot of play given to, the communal fantasies of the ruling party and all of this kind of stuff. Karnataka, again, is Kannada. A lot of the Kannada media is very communalized, and they mirror the, power balance in the state. But in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra, in Kerala, Bengal, Odisha, things are different. Which is not to say that the parties in power do not also look at local media as their own fiefs. So the central government or the national government's attitude towards media, is visible in the kind of conformity which they're able to produce. But in Bengal, I wouldn't imagine that I think that the kind of levers of coercion that the West Bengal government has over the Bengali language media, through the power of advertisements and various other kinds of pressures that they can exert. That this is also very much part of the reality. So opposition rule states, it's not as if the media is functioning in a fully free and independent fashion.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, so Siddharth, my question is generally about the nature of historical thinking in media. Because what I see, and you're doing a stunning work, I think you're one of the few people doing that kind of work, but even there, and this is a kind of, not really a criticism, but kind of thinking about what I see with Scroll and with Wired is that there's a knee-jerk reaction to the agenda that the Hindutva And we said that we've seen that since the last 8 years, there's something that happens and you respond. There's something that happens, you respond. So my question to you is that how you, as a media organization, creates a different kind of a debate in which the Hindutva figures have to respond. And that we have not seen in the last 8 years.
Yeah.
And so and I think for me that question could also, this is just a footnote, is how to think historically about the kind of questions that Sasank Paribar has been throwing to us for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Like Akhand Bharat, unfortunately, is not a 1947 question. It is not even a 1200 AD question. It is actually goes back to the Harappan question, the Indus question. So I think what I'm kind of asking is that how you as an organization are thinking of putting forward a debate in which, or an agenda in which they respond.
Can I, Siddharth, let me add to this. I've been, when we heard Paula speak and when we heard Ed describe the India that he saw, right? And when we think about how so many media organizations, I think you should certainly add to the list Indian Express, for which I write columns. I think they, and the Hindu, I think there is considerable independence shown. Not all of legacy newspapers, and Dainik Bhaskar. Dainik Bhaskar, for which I might write, they have asked me. So
Deccan Herald is also very
Deccan
very
Herald.
strong.
So I think not all of it. So we should add those also. But anyway, the point here is this: so many media organizations going through the, what did Ed say? Arnabization of people who had very different concepts of politics and India or Indian nationhood, transforming themselves in the last 8 years, right? One can think of many Arnabs actually. That theoretically leads us to Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, when he invented the concept of hegemony, he basically said that the state under certain conditions can create an appropriate atmosphere in large atmosphere through cultural organizations, especially the media, not only the media. So it would be worth asking, and as a political scientist, I deal with this question all the time, it is worth asking whether India's political common sense is going through a radical transformation. That is what it means to create hegemony. That the political common sense, the way masses speak about politics, the way masses speak about the nation, that has transformed remarkably. Now the speed may be surprising, certainly surprising, but in your view, first of all, is that hegemony becoming deeper and deeper? That's a question worth asking, and media will be part of that. Secondly, the counter-hegemonic project. Counter-hegemonic project also has to think about reconceptualizing politics and reconceptualizing what the media does. I think that's very important. This will remain a very important connection between politics and media, even in thinking about counter-hegemony. Yeah. How would you respond to this way of summarizing much of what Paula said, and now my Gramscian take on what Ed said and what the comment just was?
Yeah. No, those are great questions. I mean, frankly, a lot of media functioning, it's the nature of being primarily a news organization, that you are reporting and commenting and analyzing events as they unfold. And I think part of the hegemonic strategy of the BJP is to constantly create new events, new provocations, which you can't afford to ignore either. But the more you engage, the greater valence or greater salience those agendas acquire. And frankly, many newsrooms like ours debate what is the best way to engage with some of these things. And I don't think there's a very clear answer to that. I'm very, even though I spoke with a lot of passion about the dangers that lie ahead and so on, I'm not sure that news organizations are necessarily the locus for counter-hegemony, in the sense that our job is to report, our job is to provide a platform for discussion, our job is to help readers analyze and understand what's happening. But we reflect what others in society also are doing. So I'm not sure the entire burden of counter-hegemony can be loaded onto the media. But we try in our own way, for example, to, through investigations, through flagging certain, like I think selection of news, selection of issues for discussion and debate. When, like recently, we decided that we would do a series. It was the 70th anniversary of India's first general election, which the mainstream media completely ignored. Government wasn't bothered about the anniversary. But we decided to do 4 or 5 pieces. We had Anit Shani, we had the former election commissioner, various people writing about what the significance of the 1951-52 election was. And also looked at the role of the BJP then, the role of the Communist Party. And some, I think, valuable insights did emerge, which people may find useful. So I think there are, I think we do need to look at some of these projects that are away from the pushes and pulls of the news cycle and the, the provocations and, agendas of those who exercise hegemony. But I think that burden has to fall on many, many other people.
So that's the view which would historically and theoretically go in the following direction. That just as the hegemonic project was a political project into which the media was incorporated, or large chunks of it, not all. Counter-hegemonic project also has to begin as a political project, which can, and media can be an ally of that or can oppose that, whatever, but the media cannot be the starting point of a counter-hegemonic project, is perhaps what you're saying, exactly. That's what social science and historical examination of these projects has also said, that it has to begin as a political project, right?
I think where we come in,
yeah.
Just to build on what you said, where we come in is in recognizing the importance of something new,
yeah,
and deciding that we are going to report and focus on this. So the amount of coverage that The Wire and other smaller media gave to the farmers' protest, even when big media got sick and tired of it, right? Because it went on for a year and a half. But we stuck to the story. We didn't see them as a traffic disruption. We didn't see them as an inconvenience. We saw this as an important, mobilization with great political implications. And I think our view was, in a way, vindicated by the fact that the government finally had to climb down. So you're right. I mean, the impulse is happening elsewhere. It's happening outside. There are political mobilizations happening. It's the job of, I think, journalists to recognize their significance and to accord, in line with their own editorial judgment, the kind of importance that those mobilizations, deserve.
Right. So one final question, it came up again and again. So Ed talked about Viktor Orban. Paula talked about Erdogan, right? Trump. A lot of us have thought about this, and I've written also, both academically and in my columns. In what ways, Siddharth, you think Modi's project is either similar to Erdogan's and Orban's majoritarianism and Trumpian majoritarianism here, which is quite white nationalist actually, and in what ways it might be different?
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
So I'm keeping an eye on the clock also.
Yeah. We have 3 minutes.
Exactly. So I'll quickly run through. I think the short answer is that I think what Modi is doing is different from what Erdogan or Orban or Trump or anybody else is attempting, for the simple reason that none of these leaders has the kind of organization like the RSS, which has 100 years, been active for 100 years, has huge millions and millions of cadres, has a very well thought out planned vision and ideology which they are hell bent on implementing, whether Modi is there or not. So this agenda and this project remains and lives on. So I think that this is what gives it added menace, even beyond some of these individual leaders. But I did want to respond to 2 points Paula raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the question of tech, big tech and social media, the thing is that digital media and big tech, there's the good and the bad, right? There's no doubt that Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, they've all been enablers of hate speech, but they've also been enablers of what you would call counter-hegemony. Frankly, a platform like The Wire or Scroll or others who are active, Khabar Lahariya, wouldn't have half the reach or even 1/10 of the reach that they do today and the effect and influence were it not for social media intermediaries, right? Frankly, there are no easy answers. It's a very complicated And I think that even as we benefit from the platforms, we need to be part of the fight to ensure that they're accountable, to ensure that hate speech is curbed, etc. So there I agree with you. And on just very parenthetically on the point of, I don't think Du Bois was suggesting that discrimination in America against African Americans was not legally, did not have a legal basis. It did. But I think he was what he had in mind was the question of degree. So if the right to life of a Jew in Nazi Germany was taken away by law, the right to life in America of the African American was taken away through an act which was still illegal. Lynching may not be punished, but it still remained illegal. So I think that's probably what he was alluding to. It's a different matter that this is a little known. I mean, the quote that I've extracted from Julia Boyd's work, it's an interview that Du Bois gave after he returned from Germany in 1936. And I don't think he has elaborated on this. I take your point. I mean, and I was talking to Ashu also earlier. I don't think he would deny the importance of Jim Crow. But I think it's what he has in mind is the degree of violence.
So
exactly.
let me put it somewhat differently as a last comment here. And I've been studying this for some time. I'm beginning to write. Nazi project was an eliminate the Jew project. It was eliminationist. Jim Crow was not eliminationist. Jim Crow was about making blacks secondary citizens, right? So peripheralization is different from elimination. Fascism was an eliminationist project.
And I think
and Hindu nationalism is not an eliminationist project. It is going to peripheralize the Muslim.
It's a project of erasure, which is different from elimination, but it's more than...
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, T.S. Eliot said, people have heard me say this a few times, April is the cruelest month, but it has some redeeming features. This seminar was one. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Ed, for joining us. Thank you, Salil, and thank you, Paula, for providing some glimmers of hope and remarkably sharp analysis. Thank you. There is